Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I'm so excited for this week's episode. Every week, I get to interview incredible people from across the field of emergency management and adjacent. And this week is no different. He has a great name, John Honoré. He will be joining me. He's a meteorologist with the Texas Emergency Management. The last time I was down there for a big disaster was with Hurricane Harvey. If you've been tuning in for all 4 years, you know that first year was all about Harvey. So it's kind of a fun way to look back at that. And at the time of the recording is right around the time that Harvey happened. And by the time you hear this episode here in September, we would have been in full-fledged. And so it'll be interesting to go through that. John has an incredible understanding of emergency management. He was just telling me right before we started recording that he had joined Texas like literally right before Harvey. And so what of a turn of events for him. But with that, I'll bring John onto the stage. Hey, John, how you doing?
Good. Great to be here.
So you were just telling me about tsunami threat in the Gulf. You guys had to deal with everything in Texas. Yeah. Some I've thought about, some I clearly haven't thought about.
Right.
From your perspective of meteorology and Texas being huge, talk to us a little bit about the scope that you had to deal with.
Well, pretty much anything and everything that Mother Nature can throw at anybody gets thrown at Texas. We're the flash flood capital of the country. We certainly have our fair share of severe weather. Hurricanes, we're no stranger to hurricanes, although it's funny, you mentioned me first coming on right before Harvey. When I first signed on to TDEM, I was the hurricane preparedness coordinator for the state. Huh. And I told people, hey, I'm going to go work for the state and be the hurricane preparedness coordinator. And people said, Texas gets hurricanes? Because we hadn't had one since Ike, which was in 2008. So, it's been a little busier since I've signed on.
Yeah. You guys have had your fair share, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, wildfires are right in front of our windshield right now. We just had the worst wildfire in the history of the state last February. Had flooding after that for what seems like 2 or 3 months. And then we walked right into hurricane season and had to deal with Alberto. And, of course, we had the winter storm a couple of years ago that pretty much covered a good portion of the state, almost 2/3 of the state with snow and sub-freezing temperatures for several days.
And I think down when we were in May at the TDEM conference, I think there was even like a tornado and more flooding that was happening, and people were responding. And so you guys get the full gambit there.
Yeah.
This is going to sound kind of strange, but as a meteorologist, is that attractive to you that you get to look at so many different types of weather events, or is it because it's so nonstop, is it exhausting? Like where do you fall within that?
Both.
Yeah.
Both. It's up until a couple of months ago, I was the only meteorologist that we had on staff. I've since hired someone underneath me, but I often tell people it's a lot like being a firefighter because there's lots of downtime. And in that downtime, you're training, you're doing things to make sure you're prepared. But when things are happening like they have this year, we started the wildfire in February, and we have been going nonstop until probably a few weeks ago, and then that big ridge of high pressure that often builds over Texas and just cooks us has finally arrived, unfortunately. But it's exciting. It always keeps you interested, but it can wear you out after a few weeks without.
Yeah. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapsed and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today.
CBRNE Convergence, the world's largest conference for the non-conventional threat, is heading back to Orlando between October 28th and 30th, 2024. With 3 days of workshops, lectures, and interactive sessions delivered by speakers from around the world on the latest issues and approaches to CBRNE and hazmat. Make sure to claim your early bird discount by registering now at cbrneworld.com/event/Orlando.
I think I brought him up on the last week's episode as well. Dr. Stephen Johnson, he's the head of counter CBRN for the British Army. He's been on here a couple times. He's obviously busy with all the CBRN stuff in Europe, but he's also a police officer in London, and he's a professor at a university. And he talks about those who are highly intelligent are attracted to doing multiple different things to keep their interest, at the same time recognizing the severity of that. Texas, I don't think even myself before Harvey, I mean, obviously I understood the geography and had a basic understanding. I don't think people realize just how big Texas is and how much more complex it is because of the size of it and the populations of it compared to other states who, after Texas, I was like, are you guys really underwater here? Because I just came from this massive place. How do you guys internally deal with that? I understand the big hat thing because I was down there in Texas, but how do you deal with the persona of the complexity of so many disaster types? Does it give you a bunch of pride, or does it keep you in the game? Where do you lie in that?
Both.
A lot of both, yeah.
But we break the state down into 8 regions. Mm-hmm. Up until about a year or two ago, it was 5 regions, and we've since reorganized and broken the state down into 8 different regions. There's an assistant chief that oversees each region, and that helps us tackle the various threats to the state, makes them a bit more manageable when you've got. It's almost like we have 8 different states within the state, and we throw every resource we can at whatever Mother Nature throws at us.
I saw a funny picture of it was showing people the actual size of Texas, and it shows all these other states. It shows Maryland fitting into it, and Ohio fitting into it, and then you look closer, and North America fits into it, and Texas fits into it. And it's hilarious to think about that perspective. But
yeah, El Paso. A lot of people don't realize this. The city of El Paso, which is the westernmost part of the state, is closer to Los Angeles, California, than it is to Texarkana, Texas.
Yeah, that's massive. Harvey, we did an analysis of the spatial analysis of the flood, and it was as if everything from Maine to DC was underwater, or San Francisco to LA was underwater, just to help people understand like the scope of just the amount of flooding there.
Yeah, one of the challenges that we have here is we have disasters the size of a lot of U.S. states.
Yeah,
and they don't cover a quarter of the state sometimes.
Yeah, it's just sometimes it's hard to wrap your mind around it, to be honest. Mm-hmm.
I'll have people, friends, acquaintances, ask me what's going on. I'm like, oh, I'm working. Or they'll go, why? It's beautiful outside. What are you talking about? Not realizing that, another part of the state's suffering a presidential declared disaster.
Yeah, it's I have a in-law who's in Harris County, in Houston, and I have family also in Paso. So it's like El Paso. So even hearing their different perspectives of how things are going. But from the organization standpoint, I want to go back to that real quick. I was blown away when you said you were basically a staff of 1 before. Obviously, mm-hmm. You've been able to grow your staff. Mm-hmm. The amount of weather events that you're tracking simultaneously, you just must have incredible relationships with the National Hurricane Center, with NWS, with others. How do you actually manage that? Because from that lesson of leadership, you know, often emergency managers are managing more things than they should, right? I can't even understand how Texas would have, that single point, right? Like, what happens if you get sick? But obviously, your
Mhm.
staff has grown. How do you manage all of that?
Well, traditionally, the National Weather Service has been the weather experts for TDEM,
Hmm.
and they do a heck of a job. There are 13 different National Weather Service forecast offices that cover the state, and we need them, no doubt about it. They're a 24/7 operation that covers a 24/7 threat. So part of what I do is I'm not so much focused on what I think an event is probably going to bring the state. I get more focused on, okay, meteorology is a very humbling science, especially in an active weather situation, a dynamic weather situation where the possibility for us of being wrong, yes, meteorologists have been wrong, is there. And a big part of my job is to determine, okay, if this goes sideways, how is it going to go wrong? And how bad can bad get? What do we as a state need to be prepared for as far as a worst case scenario goes? And so that's a huge part of what I and now my new meteorologists do here for the state is we're making sure that we don't get caught in an event flat-footed.
In terms of the weather events like hurricanes, obviously, or the winter weather events, possibly tsunami, I don't know, whatever it is. But in terms of those events, which ones, from the Gulf perspective, are you thinking about the most? Is it hurricanes year round? I mean, what is most of your focus on?
I would have to say flooding. We've got a corridor that runs in a part of the state that's kind of in the south central part of the state, from Del Rio to San Antonio, and we call that the Balcones Escarpment, and then up I-35 from San Antonio to the DFW area. That's known as Flash Flood Alley. Everyone's heard of Tornado Alley. Tornadoes get all the headlines. They're violent. They do a lot of damage. Flooding, not so much. And flooding is an incredibly underrated threat. And so Flash Flood Alley is right here in Texas, and that is by far the number one threat to the state as far as the threat to life. Hurricanes obviously are a big threat, and with the onset of Harvey, I believe that is by far the most costly natural disaster we've experienced in the last couple of decades, if not in the state's history. The winter storm was certainly something that was up there. But one thing that's also very underrated is drought. And another one of my duties here is I'm the subject matter expert on the State Drought Preparedness Council. And I mentioned before, the state's broken down into 8 different regions. And in about 2 or 3 of those regions, the costliest disasters over the course of the last 2 decades are from drought, and primarily the damage that is done to agriculture, which is a huge part of the economy for this state.
Yeah, that's. I mean, obviously, you think Texas, you think droughts are more than a possibility, but
well, an old Texas meteorologist. This is one of my favorite quotes about the weather in Texas, and it's attributed to an anonymous. They call him the state meteorologist in Texas, and I think it's from 1927. And he said, "Texas is a land of perennial drought that is occasionally broken by a devastating flood," and that's accurate. That was accurate then. It's accurate now.
Yeah. In terms of the flash flooding, so you mentioned the winter event, flash flooding. Those events I attribute, and correct me if I'm wrong, more with man-made issues rather than the natural issue, because You know, if I look at the both of those situations, utility companies and/or critical infrastructure, the way it's designed, and this could be true for anywhere, so it's not a Texas thing, to be honest, but it's just the vulnerabilities of infrastructure, right? As soon as you put concrete in a place, now you have a flooding issue. From the meteorology and future planning perspective, are you working on teams to say, hey, because we know we have this, flash flooding alley, for example, what are you guys doing to help mitigate that for the future?
So it depends on what part of the state you're talking about. I mean, we're such a huge and diverse state. Now, Houston they almost have their own sort of self-sufficient emergency management infrastructure with their own meteorologist, with the Harris County Flood Control Project. Mm-hmm. And they are constantly trying to upgrade their flood mitigation there, because it's an area where it is somewhat of a man-made problem, yes. But again, Texas is the land of perennial drought that's occasionally broken by a devastating flood, and it's always been that way.
Yeah.
You get into the Texas Hill Country, you don't have that infrastructure problem. You just have a very hilly, rocky soil topography that naturally creates what we call an orographic lift. You get that rise in elevation with the moisture coming off the Gulf of Mexico, helps to enhance rainfall over that area, and it causes catastrophic flooding. Some of the worst floods in this state's history have been in the Austin and San Antonio areas. And the flood mitigation there is a bit different, where you're looking at flood control dams. We have a problem. I mentioned drought. I don't think we've built a reservoir here in Texas in at least a couple of decades, and we've added 20% of the population since the last drought of record, which was in 2011, 2012. And that's another thing that the flip side of the flooding, when we do have flooding, is we've got to figure out how to capture this water and store it, because that is going to become a huge problem in this state going forward if we continue to get the population influx that we've seen over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, that's very interesting to bring that up. I was interviewing somebody from California, and it was right around the time that they had a, oh my gosh, what is that called? Atmospheric river. Mm-hmm. And I was so disappointed. As a guy who lived in California for 5 years, I've lived all over the U.S., but so disappointed when they let 90% of that water go back into the ocean. It's like, man, they were having such a drought issue. It's great to hear that Texas Emergency Management is trying to focus on, hey, how do we capture this water, especially with the drought issue? People forget, especially people who don't live in like super dry climates, like in the Northeast, that droughts cause flooding. Mm-hmm. And it's such a basic thing if you live there, right? The soil gets hard, and that's where you get your flash floods, and that's where you start getting all these other cascading impacts. So you want to keep it more wet, and yet you guys have such an opportunity because of the huge rains that come in through, because of what's happening in the Gulf.
Yeah, and we call it, we've talked about this a lot in the last couple of years, and we're calling it kind of a moonshot type of problem, in that we're confounded as to what's the best way to go about capturing water or even moving water across the country. We've had some ideas of people wanting to run pipelines from the Mississippi River, and that comes with all sorts of problems that you can run into. Others have wanted a pipeline in water from the Gulf of Mexico, do desalinization plants, and that's something that we're branching out into a little bit more. But that's right now is somewhat cost prohibitive. I don't think people realize how much electricity that it takes to do something like that. Electricity is also a big issue that we have here, the electrical grid, keeping it up and going, so the capture of water here is not an easy thing, and so Yeah, I kind of empathize with California and having to let that water just run out, because we're definitely open to hearing any and all ideas people have as far as how to capture that water.
Yeah, a lot of the ideas I've heard about that kind of stuff too, because I was working on the DHS critical infrastructure project, and it's always pipelines from existing water sources. This is going to be a really basic question. Please don't laugh at me immediately. Why can't we focus on capturing the water that falls from the sky, right? Like all the rain that falls. There's the amount of flooding that happens in Texas and other places from just rain. And yet people want to tap into existing water sources where they'd have to have the desalination projects. What's the problem with that?
So the number one solution would be build more reservoirs, right? Sounds easy. Okay. How are you going to acquire that land?
Yeah.
Just think about acquiring the land and what that's going to take. Just that alone, much less all the different environmental regulations, et cetera. It's, so it's not, it sounds like it should be an easy fix, and it's not.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there has to be so much that goes into that. From a power perspective, eventually, if you can build the reservoirs, you might be able to build dams and create power. And there could be some cascading impacts. It doesn't mean it's necessarily easy, though, right? So,
well, I think hydroelectric here is not a power source that I think probably less than 1% of our electricity comes from hydroelectric, and I think a lot of that is the stream flow. Quite often is just not there. Again, land of perpetual drought, broken by a devastating flood. So a lot of the times the rivers just aren't flowing in a manner that and not enough of them for a state the size of Texas to really squeeze out the electricity we would need from them.
Copy. All right. So we're moving into this kind of this next phase here, talking about future projects, meteorology, things that are happening. You mentioned earlier the complexity of meteorology. I think it was State University of New York was talking about when they came on, Jason Cradaville, so shout out to him, like quantum computing that was trying to be done to better understand weather patterns. And we've had a couple really great people here talking about it from your perspective and trying to understand weather in the future. What are the tools that emergency managers can access, especially if they're not a meteorologist, to start better understanding besides, oh, hey, look, that's green and that's red, so red's bad. How can they start to be able to make smarter decisions?
I would say just find yourself a subject matter expert. Hire, if the weather is that serious a problem, if you can't hire an in-house meteorologist to be a subject matter expert for you, then definitely really foster a good relationship with your National Weather Service meteorologist. And I think that's what a lot of the locals here in Texas do. And that's really the best way to go about staying on top of the weather. And if, going with someone who has been in your region for a long time. I've been a professional meteorologist for about 30 years now, and most of that has been in Texas. And a lot of my knowledge has been learning from past events. And that's kind of what has sharpened my sword when it comes to forecasting, is being able to look at an event and go, okay, this reminds me of what happened back in 1998. That's what I rely on. As far as technology goes, I think so much of it is so complicated and advanced that trying as an emergency manager without any background whatsoever, trying to become sort of a casual subject matter expert in that, you're asking for trouble. You're asking to be knowledgeable enough to be dangerous. So yeah, find yourself a good subject matter expert, create a good relationship with them, and rely on them.
Hey, we just want to do a quick pause X to thank all of our sponsors with the Readiness Lab Podcast Network, L3 Harris, Forerunner, C. Bernie World, HQE Systems, Ampapar Response Training Center, Impulse, Doberman Emergency Management, and especially all of you who subscribe to the TRL Insider Program and who are listening to this episode right now. Thank you so much for your support. Let's jump back in. I know that, ironically, pun intended, a lot of people are underwater. There's a lot of emergency managers. Duty is set aside. There's a lot of fire chiefs who listen to our podcast. Who are like, hey, I have a role as an emergency manager, but my full-time job is a fire chief. And we think about them quite a bit on this podcast because of that, and trying to give them anything that can help them out. We always go back to this idea of coordination and collaboration, like using the public resources that allow people. My thing is, I don't want people to guess or to assume, and just trying to understand the environment around you. I love the open source data stuff, the river gauge data that they can access, USGS and NWS, National Hurricane Center, starting to aggregate those things. My thing is, if you can find somebody from even a basic like dashboard from Esri that combines a lot of those different layers so they can have better situational awareness, that'd probably be helpful. But ultimately, we have to get beyond the guesswork, and we need to start relying on experts like yourself to be able to help us out. From your view on working with emergency managers as a meteorologist, what are some of the gaps identified, or at least I'll ask the second part of that question later, gaps identified that you're like, ooh, if you're an emergency manager, I need to make sure that you know X, Y, and Z. What are some of those things that could help us out?
Well, it depends on what the threat is, but I always, approach my job from a standpoint of, if my superiors, my leaders in this organization are in the middle of an event and I hear them go, "Oh, fill in your favorite expletive here," I didn't do my job. So just making sure people know, often people know early, well before a potential event, put it on their radar screen so that they are constantly checking. They are, once it's determined that we do have a legitimate potential threat, that we are starting to move personnel and assets in place that so we don't. I want them going, "Oh, fill in your favorite expletive here," before the event, not during the event. Yeah. So that's how I go about doing my job. It's great you mentioned the collaboration. One of my favorite Chief Kiddisms, Chief Nimkid, for those of you who don't know, head of the agency. One of his go-to directives is stay in your lane. So my lane is the meteorology, and he's done a fantastic job of hiring different subject matter experts to put in different lanes. So my job is to stay in my lane, and all these other lanes to take away from what I'm doing in my lane to help them do their job better.
By the way, howdy to him, right?
Yeah.
He's always this big thing. Howdy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So big shout out to Director Kidd there. Okay, as we're wrapping up, you had mentioned these big events, and this is kind of a little bit of different turn that I've taken in the past, but I'm hyper curious. The big events for you, the big weather events for you that have steered your career, what are some of those, I wouldn't say highlights, but what are some of those moments you're like, oh, that's a moment in time for me?
So before I joined TDEM, I worked in television news for 23 years. And I had a stint in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. We had a tornado hit downtown Fort Worth. I believe that was March of 2000. I worked in San Antonio, and one of the first big events, and probably the biggest event in the 12 years that I was there, was a massive flood in late June, early July of 2002. And that's one of those events that I learned from, and actually was able to apply what I learned to the potential threat that Hurricane Harvey posed to the state. I remember when we were watching Harvey move across the Atlantic and then eventually in the Gulf of Mexico. I know a lot of folks were worried about Harvey intensifying into a major hurricane, and that's certainly something that we needed to be worried about. But one of the things that I really locked in on early was the forecast path of the storm and how slow it was moving. And it reminded me a lot of that flood of 2002. And even though the flood of 2002 was not produced by a tropical system, it had the same characteristics in that you had this weak area of low pressure float around an area for several days, and it put down 30, 40 inches of rain over a large area of the Texas Hill Country. So when the computer models were forecasting outrageous amounts of rain for Hurricane Harvey, and a lot of people were kind of going, oh, that can't be real. I was thinking that absolutely can be real because I've seen it happen before. So that was another. The flood of 2002 was something that really stands out in my mind as something that was a huge learning experience for me. And then after Harvey, we had Tropical Storm Imelda and did very similar things to Southeast Texas that Harvey did. Not quite to the same extent, but still it was another slow-moving tropical system that made its way on shore and dumped a tremendous amount of rain. So, and then just most recently, we're always on top of the wildfire situation, especially in West Texas, especially in late winter and early spring. And we had conditions that were critical to elevated. They didn't get to that extremely critical category that you see from the Storm Prediction Center, but without that, we still had the worst wildfire in the state's history in the Panhandle this February. So that was another learning experience that even though conditions may not be extreme, you certainly can get a worst case scenario out of that.
That's a great call out there for the end. I think so many times, and I'm guilty of this too, even in our training and our exercise, we think of like the most catastrophic experience we can think of. And therefore, if I can deal with catastrophic, then I can deal with something less. But people often miss, I want to say the everyday stuff, but a slow moving storm can produce what a hurricane can produce. Now, a hurricane brings in other things, sure, but the fact that you were able to compare those two shows the type of leader that you are, shows the type of mind that you have, and we need that more in emergency management and really emergency services. Sometimes we're like, oh, this isn't the exact same thing, but you can still pull lessons from all this stuff.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that with me and for coming on today and really providing guidance to the state of Texas. Obviously, you're doing good things, and I hope you guys are the best, and I hope that you don't have another Hurricane Harvey anytime soon. So,
well, thank you very much. It was great to be on, and I'll come back anytime you want me to.
Great. We'll see you every week. So that'll be good. Well, John, thanks again. For everybody who tuned in, who's thinking about weather, who's thinking about, hey, whether it's duties assigned or you have your own in-house expert, weather is a big, big driver for our economy, for critical infrastructure, for obviously saving people's lives. We see that every day in emergency services. And so think about that. Think about those impacts. If you got something out of this episode, we say the same thing every time. Give us that 5-star rating, subscribe. If you have a very specific question for John, you can contact us at contact@thereadinesslab.com, and we'll forward it on to him. If you are in Texas and you got something out of it, put it on the comments. We'd love to be able to see that as well. And with that, we'll see you for the next one. Peace.